Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to, what is it called? The Caffeine Stream?
The
Yes.
Caffeine Stream, yeah.
I'm to a good start already. All right, this is episode 44 of the Caffeine Stream. This is another Caffeine Stream After Dark. That's a name I just came up with, but I had a thought, and I wanted to see if you will partake with me, which is White Claw in the evening, as the civilized basic girls do.
You're pretending like you've already had a White Claw. You haven't even had 2 sips of that.
Okay, it has touched my lips, and it is taken its appropriate effect of inducing the appearance of being near people who drink for fun.
Whatever.
Okay. Regardless, you can I will catch up. Okay, I will catch up. I'm working on it. I wanted to talk with you because I have a lot of random lucid thoughts about things that have come up on the podcast recently, and I thought it would be amusing, perhaps, to take some tangential digressions off of things that were once talked about in a more coherent fashion by you previously on the Caffeine Stream.
So this will be kind of an interrogation and defense on a wide range of subjects. Is that right?
As well as maybe just some silly stuff that also I thought was funny from your Instagram stories recently as well. I've got many things to opine on, and I have been waiting to tell you all my silly thoughts.
Okay. Well, so it's funny because for anyone who's listening to this, I had originally resisted this idea because I'm like, no, we need to have a theme. But then I recalled all of the discussions I've had with literally everybody ever. And I realized actually the best discussions usually are like free-form things. So I'll probably figure out some appropriate title for this conversation after we figure out where this goes. But it looks like you have some notes to go over. So what's first on your agenda?
So I was a good girl and I made some notes. So I wanted to just harken back to the previous time I was on the podcast on episode 40 and tell you that I will tell you, you still never convinced me that drag is not a fetish thing. I listened back to it and I'm like, you didn't convince me in the moment. You didn't convince me playing back. I think I still am correct that is fundamentally a weird sex thing.
Well, okay. So, if you will recall, I agreed with you at 95%. My whole position was that, obviously today, almost everything that is called a drag show is just queer activism. It's just political, sexualized, stuff. My whole point was that drag as a term that is interchangeable with cross-dressing has this potential for another role that we can see in this performative entertainment function that isn't that. And so it becomes a conversation about the word and what does the word drag definitionally imply. And we can go back and forth on the what's the correct use of this word, but I'm kind of less interested in that than in the concept. And perhaps I was misusing the term. I got some feedback from a friend, Joe, who I'd like to bring on the podcast at some point in the near future, who also slightly sided with you on the general point because, drag has that connotation. I think it's one of those cases though, where the word drag is actually older than the phrase drag show. Sort of the same deal with capitalism, where capital is older than capitalist, which is much older than capitalism. And there's subtle differences in connotation that come with the age that these words come into being within, if you know what I mean.
Perhaps. I'm just saying, no matter how many times we rehash this topic, I think it's a fetish thing.
Well, okay. So let me ask the question this way. Do you think that there are performative cross-dressing entertainment events that are not sexual fetishes primarily? like Monty Python?
I don't know the interpersonal life of every guy who's on Monty Python,
Oh
so
my
I'm not
God.
sure what other weird stuff let's be real. The English are pretty weird. They're not German, but they're from a very small, weird island. Very, very queer, shall we say.
Oh, okay. Well, if you won't grant me that, then I guess I will have to concede the point. I'll leave it. I'll leave it to the audience's judgment what their opinion of that question is.
And this is the unfalsifiability of those who will not change their opinion in the face of new information. Okay, well, anyway, I wanted to start with that just to say that, like, one of the pleasures of having a philosopher for a husband is that you spend a lot of time talking about the same thing over and over again and then rehashing it to decide if you really changed your mind, and I did not.
But I think this is in some ways the most important question in all of philosophy, which is like the relationship between the words we use to describe things and the things themselves. If you can get to the heart of that relationship, you kind of get to the heart of all of philosophy, which was Wittgenstein's big project. And in my opinion, perhaps the most respectable philosopher of the last century, because he changed his mind so publicly after such a well-received book. So I think if we can get past the word drag and focus on the concept, the thing being described, there's clearly something poisonous and, I've argued elsewhere, objectively evil, which is not something to assert lightly in the queer movement. But that's not to say that all cross-dressing, which is one manifestation of the queer movement among many, many, many manifestations, is inherently bad and indefensible.
All right. Well, if we're gonna parse the word out, then I will agree with you that it is possible to cross-dress without the intention to make it some kind of weird fetishy thing. Drag, I think, is like if it's a series of concentric circles in like Venn diagrams overlapping, or dare I say, a spectrum. If it's a spectrum, drag is somewhere to the left of cross-dressing. Cross-dressing is somewhat more acceptable.
Do those circles intersect somewhere? Would you say there's an intersectional region between those things that we might particularly disagree with?
If Robert Downey Jr. had also worn a dress in Tropic Thunder, then yes, I would say.
Oh, we're hitting all the transitions there.
Indeed. All right. Well, now, but here's an interesting, this is almost like I teed it up, you guys. You mentioned that the core thing of philosophy is, getting to the heart of what a word means and like the truest sense of it. Sounds uncannily like the forms, which is one of those things that's very well known about Plato.
Well, right. The funny thing about the word form, which the Greek escapes me at the moment. It's like phainos, I think. I might be completely missing that. But the word can be literally translated as idea. Scholars have just converged on this translation as form because it's a little bit more memorable than Plato's ideas. Plato's form is a little bit more distinct in a field dominated by ideas as like a meta concept, speaking of troubles with words. And yeah, the whole idea is that hang
on. My weird brain went immediately to the problem of name brands that become oh gosh, I can't think of what the word is for when that happens. When a brand name becomes a generic such that it loses its copyrightability. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Like a Q-tip?
Yes, like Q-tips and zippers and nylons and what's the other one that I was just thinking of? Like Google was in danger of this for a while when a copyrighted word.
I was just noticing I was wrong. The word is not phanos, that means shining. It's eidos, just for the nerds out there.
Yeah, so anyway, I'm just imagining the trials and tribulations.
That
Plato.
word is not copyrighted, by the way.
If we were to try to stand by, like, no, ideas are what Plato had everything else that people have called an idea, those are the generic. Just thinking of the mission creep of like, let's try and stick that word ideas and make that stick to just what we now think of as forms.
So to give some like texture to this, Plato's idea of the forms is the foundation for what later became known as philosophical idealism. This is more generally associated with Berkeley and a few others, but it's the idea that ideas are in some sense more real than the physical world, because the creation of objects, whether it's a tree or a rock or a chair or a human being, all follow from a kind of blueprint, which is an idea. And the idea exists in a metaphysically distinct space from physical matter. And so if the idea precedes the formation of the matter, the idea is in some sense more real. But, we don't call it formism, we call it idealism. So it gives you some linguistic understanding of the relationship between forms and ideas. They're basically identical.
I maybe drank my White Claw too quickly to try to catch up to you, but that's like the synapses were firing on that one. That now completely makes sense that the idealism as a term literally has the same etymology as idea, obviously, which like anyone who was actually thinking would have thought of that. But yeah, like the idea that forms, idea, and idealism are all actually essentially the same word.
Yeah, well, and this is, again, to go back to the whole, like, not trans. I'm getting my ideas confused here.
Your forms.
Right, my forms. To go back to our previous subject here, this is where things get confusing. I have to go over this every time we get into a conversation with my friend Jack Donovan, who I need to bring back on this podcast at some point. We had a great.
I don't know if he drinks White Claw.
No, he's more of a vodka guy. But but like we were talking about AI art, and he and I will occasionally have conversations about idealism, and we always have to like have the same conversation because he's very pro idealism in the sense of having aspirations and having positive visions that are greater than the sort of ordinary, mundane, mediocre status quo. I'm not phrasing it correctly, but like having aspirations is basically the colloquial connotation of idealism. And most people, when they talk about idealism, aren't meaning the metaphysical notion that no, ideas and mind are in fact more real than physical matter. Like, it's the word idealism can actually mean different things too, which sort of goes back to the trouble with the word drag. It's like, okay, what's the actual concept? I love that line that Bruce Lee gives in Enter the Dragon, where he's talking to a student and he says, it's like a finger pointing towards the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger, or you will miss all the heavenly glory. And of course, I think if we apply this to philosophy and to language, the finger is the word. The word points at the thing, but the word is not the thing itself. And it can be very easy. This is where I get into arguments with Christians a lot who identify the name of God with God himself. And that's actually true in some pagan worlds too, but I digress.
Oh, this is an episode for digressions, my friend. That reminds me very much of when I was in college and learning Spanish, because the way that the language is constructed it's not possible to speak of certain, especially things like accidents, in the active voice. So, for us, I was going to say Westerners, but obviously Spain's part of the West. For us Germanic speakers.
Us Northerners.
Been on the right side of history on many levels. This is not true at all. This is very much not true. Anyway, well, it depends on what you think the course of history means. Anyway, never mind. So, regardless, someone sent the ships. We're here now. This is where we are. So, anyway, point is, but the way that their language is constructed to say things like, the chair was broken by so and so, or like the clothes were ripped by so and so, or the soup was spilled by so and so, and that construction, there is not a way to say you broke my leg. You have to say my leg was broken by you. And that weird like passive inversion, I found it just astounding. I was like, oh my gosh, this like, it doesn't explain anything, but like what a different way of thinking about the world. And none of my classmates were remotely bothered by that.
Yeah. Well, and this gets really tricky in imagining the counterfactual, because if you were raised in that language, would that structure have the same connotative feeling that it does when you're raised in an English grammatical structure where the active voice is fault finding and also like praise and blameworthy implying, whereas the passive voice is just, oh, the thing happened. But there are languages, and Japanese comes to mind because that's what I was trained in when I was in high school and college, where a lot of subtlety is read into very formal language that to an English speaker would sound kind of passive, but there's so much
context.
There's so much context, yes. There's so much weight in that context conveyed in a very subtle way that you get kind of acclimated to it. And I remember listening to Philip Zimbardo talk about the psychology of time at some TED Talk where he was basically making this point. And like how our brains adapt to language might make it kind of difficult to understand what is actually conveyed as a native speaker of that language unless you were raised in it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Would you like to hear a little villain origin story of how Chris and Sierra came to be? So once upon a time, we were riding a bus back from a debate competition, and in the world's most interesting conversation that I ever had in my entire life, I got to flex on the fact that I have met Philip Zimbardo. Before he was
fell from grace in academia.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're not familiar with Philip Zimbardo, his most famous thing is the Stanford Prison Experiment. And we managed to have such a wide-ranging conversation. The first conversation we ever had touched on things like Christianity and atheism and consciousness, the origins of consciousness, Homer, the fact that I've met Philip Zimbardo and Penn Jillette, and that we were both for libertarian, and we were both like, who are you? So I met Philip Zimbardo at the Western Psychological Association convention that I attended with my mother, who is a professor. That's how I got to meet Philip Zimbardo, in case you were wondering. Let's see, we were talking about time.
We were talking about the way that although different languages can convey things in an active or passive voice or different time tenses, the difference that we experience as native English, can't speak. These Voodoo Rangers are killing me. As native speakers of English, won't necessarily capture how a native speaker of another language, say Spanish, experiences that language relative to how we would experience it, because the connotations of these subtleties and these absences are different.
Maybe if I give you the details, you'll be able to help me generate the author's name. I sent you that reel, or maybe you sent it to me, of that author who is fluent in both English and Spanish, and he was saying how English is a more beautiful language.
Oh yes, he's He's the author of my favorite podcasters who I haven't listened to in a while, David Pizarro and Tamler Summers from the Very Bad Wizards talk about it a lot. Yeah, he's that Latin American author. Let me look him up. He's written.
Jamie, look that up.
Right. He wrote that library. He's a short story writer.
Yeah, well, he did an interesting. I heard a reel. I think this was a very, very old recording. I'm sure I don't remember what year the recording was from, but he was remarking that English is a much more beautiful language because we have kept and held on to so many different words for the same thing, whereas
Borges. Luis Borges.
We've kept our like various heritage words, so you can say things. You can say, he stood over her, but you can also say he loomed over her. And the switching back and forth between like the more Germanic or the more romantic version of the same phrase, yes. It adds so much more texture to English.
He said that Latin has this very high positive sound to it, whereas the Saxon and the Germanic roots have a very dark kind of Gothic feel to them, and so you can color your language depending on the tone you want to attach to your ideas with different rooted words.
I think the other example he gave was the difference between like ghost and a phantom.
Yeah,
and it's I mean that's one of the things I've always loved about English is that it's just
or spirit.
Oh, yeah.
Spirit is Latin, but ghost is a very dark Anglo-Saxon word. But spirit is much higher sounding Latin word. And of course, there's my favorite, which are the Greeks, which are, I think, more Latin in tone than they are Anglo-Saxon. Anglo-Saxon is pretty unique.
What are you referring to? What do you mean, the Greek language?
Yeah, well, because English has a lot of Greek roots, which are not the same as Latin roots.
Oh, I guess I'm waiting for you to give me an example. What are you thinking of? Or are you just saying in general?
Oh, well, the Greek word, ghost, spirit, I guess it would be pneuma.
Which, I wonder, no, phantom isn't the same there. So trying to think of where we use that in a similar way.
So, I'm sorry, pneuma is like spirit. It would be tsoukas. Tsoukas would be the Greek word for spirit or ghost. So it's described the tsoukas of dead soldiers on the battlefield flittering away to Hades. And tsoukas is kind of neutral, I suppose. I would say it's still a little closer to Latin in that feel of the sound. This goes back, if we're going to talk Plato, to one of my favorite dialogues, Cratylus, where they talk about
wait. Cratylus as in Cratylus and Krista, or is that something else?
No, the dialogue is just called Cratylus.
Oh, okay.
Where Socrates, I think it's Socrates, is talking with Cratylus about the proper names of things.
Oh, I'm mixing with Shakespeare. That's what I'm getting confused by. Sorry.
Oh, yes. Not Troilus and Cressida.
That is, every time you say that, I literally, my brain does a word scramble, and I can't see I don't even know what letters are in those words. I don't know where the spaces are. None of that name makes any sense to me.
It's all Greek to the proverbial person. But in Cratylus, Plato basically describes a conversation where they basically reverse engineer words, and it first begins by association, but it eventually works its way all the way back to the connotations of the sounds themselves in an almost musical quality. Like what does that hard D sound bring to mind inherently? And what emotions do these certain words bring up?
That's funny because this is my second business school reference that I want to throw out, because I remember discussing that when we were talking about apparently a long time ago in the OOs, late OOs, Starbucks tried to launch smoothies because people kept coming to Starbucks and thinking that they sold smoothies. I don't know how anyone came to this inane conclusion, but they were like, hey, do you make smoothies? And the people at Starbucks were like, no, we make coffee. So Starbucks was like, what if we made smoothies? And this is a true story. I learned this from a lady who came and talked to my business, one of my entrepreneurship classes. And she said that they did so much research to, Starbucks, of course, they're like, every size cup they have still means big. They're like tall, grande, and venti. And it's like venti's the only one that's actually...
Can I give a digression? I went to McDonald's to buy food for the family, and I actually tried to order a small. And they said, I'm sorry, that's not an option we have. There's only medium or large. I had to comment on it. I'm like, that's kind of funny, isn't it? And she said, yeah, it was. So it just amused me that the small is not even an option. But
I never thought to ask because I always order medium.
Yeah, the medium is actually the small. They just changed the names.
Oh, supersize me is real. That's well, at least they don't ask to supersize you anymore. Actually, there is no supersize. It's just implied that there's bigger and smaller, but actually there's just medium and large. There's only 2 sizes left, guys. Pretty soon we're just gonna be down to mediums. Oh no.
Yeah, well.
Anyway, so back to my Starbucks story though. So apparently briefly, and like I'm talking circa 2008, 2009, like a long time ago, Starbucks tried to launch smoothies. And so they did all this research to try and come up with the right name for what to call a Starbucks brand smoothie. And they came up with Vivano. They were going to have Vivano smoothies. And I remember this distinctly because we happen to have, of all people, an Italian in our class. And this Italian gal was like, God, that's amazing. She couldn't get over the fact that they had made up a word to make it sound, I don't know, if you're going to have a smoothie on the list next to, which I don't know where the word smoothie comes from, but it sounds awfully, Anglo-Saxon and guttural to me. If you're going to have a word like smoothie on the menu next to cappuccinos and mochas and, espressos, it's like it was off brand. So they needed a non-smoothie word for smoothies. And so they came up with Vivano, and the Italian was like, God, that sounds like Italian. She couldn't get over how well they had done it fabricating an Italian word out of nowhere.
I'm going to throw this out for anyone who's listening to this. Go do yourself a favor and go YouTube search. I'll throw this in the links. What English sounds like to non-English speakers. Oh, yeah. It's one of the most surreal linguistic experiences you'll have if you haven't already seen those.
Oh yeah, it's like uncanny. You're like it's sort of how I feel whenever I listen to like somebody speaking Dutch also. Dutch for some reason to me I'm like, "Ooh, I almost understand what you're saying." But I critically don't. I have no idea what you're talking about. I'm like, and so like it almost hurts. You're like, I so desperately want to understand. I would just want to know what you're talking about.
You feel like you're following along the conversation, but you're being distracted, so you're not quite catching what they're saying. Yeah. Like it's a very strange sensation, feeling like you should understand it, but just barely missing it. And it's like, no, this is actually nonsense, but it's nonsense.
Very convincing nonsense.
Like it's nonsense structured upon the sounds of your language.
Yeah. Well, so this is an interesting language transition to something that I hadn't intended to talk about, but we've been discussing a lot, which is Chris cannot recommend a book to me that is written by a native English speaker, and I have such native English prejudice. I can't handle it. Like if we were to go through every book I've ever read, the preponderance of not just English as in like the native language that was spoken by the author who wrote it, but like England, like straight from the soil, English that all my favorite books, almost all the books I've ever read, I would stand by, I would probably bet money that it's at least 70% of the books that I have ever read in my life were written by native English people. And you have tried to recommend 3 books to me. One written by a Spanish person who wrote it in English, one written by a Swede who wrote it in English, and one written by a Japanese person in English.
Was that Haruki Murakami?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then I think Sophie's World is written by, he looks Swedish, Justine Gardner, pretty sure.
I'm pretty sure he's Swedish, and then Flanders Panel is Spanish, so.
I every time out of love for you, I desperately want to try to force myself to read it, but my finely attuned aesthetic appreciation for the language of English is like, oh, some of these vowels don't go together in this order. Like, you're not wrong, but I hate it.
You know what you should read, babe? You should read Beowulf.
Oh.
It's English. It
is true English.
True English.
It's very English. I also tried to read you guys
Anyway, goddamn. I don't know the rest.
When I was probably 12 or 13, when I said I was going to raw dog Canterbury Tales in Middle English, and I was like, I'll figure it out. I'll translate it myself. I was like a very, very bored 13-year-old homeschool kid who thought I was going to read that. It was too hard. Canterbury Tales is rough. That is not a recognizable English to me, but I tried. I do want to transition, though, because I did have a couple notes, because I had many, many thoughts on the Work podcast.
Oh, okay.
That episode 42 was the Work podcast, and I have a gazillion thoughts, starting with the fact that notice how all three of the major people talking about the nature of work are unmarried, childless dudes. And
yeah, how is Mike Rowe unmarried?
That is, seriously, that was literally in my original notes as I was like writing things down. I'm like, the one person who has like the ethos of the world right somehow didn't get rewarded with a wife and like a gazillion children, even though it doesn't track. I don't understand. Dude, I can't tell you the crush I had on Mike Rowe back in like the late 00s, man. Your future wife was... I really liked Dirty Jobs. It was a very good show.
You could do worse. You could do worse.
The weird part, though, is that, when you realize that someone is the same age as your dad, and then you're like, and it kind of like reverse ruins all of the moments that you were like, God, that guy's kind of hot. And then you're like, no. Now you have to like scrub your brain and try and undo it. It's a hard time, guys. Big crush on Mike Rowe. I would listen to him sing me You're a Mean One, Mr. Grinch any day of the week, though. All times of year.
A lot of people don't know that he was like a trained opera singer before he got into sales and then got into work, basically.
And maybe that's why he couldn't land himself. I know he's got some kind of long-term girlfriend, although I don't know her name, but
maybe he's married in like a libertarian sense.
Well, it's possible, but maybe the reason why he wasn't able to achieve the ends that come from being a normal work guy is because he wasn't a normal work guy. The truth is, he's a philosopher who observed it, and he like kind of in a not to diminish in any way the stuff he did for Dirty Jobs and like Deadliest Catch and those other shows that he narrated, but like. He kind of went in there and did some vanity work. Like, he only had to be there for like one day or however long they were filming, and then he left. It's not like he is an appreciator of work the way that an art appreciator appreciates art, but does not themselves, or not an art appreciator, but like a critic can appreciate and evaluate art, but does not themselves actually make any. So maybe that's why he couldn't get the aims that come from the just rewards that come from being a traditional hardworking normal person, is because he actually isn't, even though he is a champion of it.
Well, that's one way of interpreting it. The other way of interpreting it is like maybe he didn't want that. There are people who just don't want to be married.
Not to sound like that one Nazi guy, but never trust a man who doesn't want a wife and children.
I'm gonna disagree with the Nazi in this case.
Well, I mean,
There's all kinds of people with all kinds of different weird inclinations and habits and foils, and they all come with their own strengths and weaknesses, and you have to be mindful of those. But like, if you understand the person you can learn to trust them on their own grounds. And
See, this is your tendency to be wildly more open-minded than I am. I like to entertain ideas with you, but like you're fundamentally more, you're like everyone. Hey, not all drag queens are perverts, and not all.
I was the one disagreeing on feminists, though. I said there are no good feminists, so
that might be true.
I'm not, but yeah, I am a little bit more open, maybe to a fault. It's not great to be that open. It leads to problems, and if it's too severe, you have to become a philosopher just to function. So maybe a conversation for another time.
Well, so I did want to dig into a couple of other themes that came up in the work podcast, because one of them was the reason I think it's interesting to remark on the fact that they're all unmarried, men without children, is that you can't. It's very hard to hack the life of parenting. There are things you can do to make the logistics that go around your children go more smoothly. Like you can improve your laundry systems, you can get better washing dishes, you can, line up more convenient snacks and television. But the actual act of parenting, the work of being a parent and also of being a good spouse, is not hackable. You can't be like, the 4-hour parenting week.
Right.
Well, and I would argue that all the dudes who are currently struggling only getting to see their kids on a weekend are like 4 hours is not enough. It's in it. That's the macabre joke of the day. Like 4 hours is not enough to parent your children. I like to think that our 5-year-old would take care of the other kids if we only showed up for 4 hours a week, but I don't think she would. No, she's not.
Zero chance she would.
She's the oldest golden eaglet who 100% will kill her younger siblings to ensure her own survival.
Oh no, that's the 1.5-year-old. The 5-year-old would just ignore them and narrate her own internal thoughts to nobody in particular.
Oh God, that is so true. The unending narration that we have to counter by coming down here and having a podcast where we talk only to each other and not to her.
But I think the point is astute, that the Tim Ferriss view behind the 4-hour work week and that general 80-20 approach to life is essentially a systems approach to, okay, here's a particular task. It presumes a kind of system within the task and asks the question, okay, how can I game this system? No matter what the task happens to be, how can I game the system in order to accomplish my goals? And the thing with kids is you can't really think of them as systems. They're not, it's not that clear cut, and there isn't a singular goal.
Well, and they're a constantly moving target. And it's interesting too to me that when these guys talk about all the things you can do once you have established this 4-hour work week, he lists off travel and all these other things that you can do, you can skydive, and it's or you can have as many babies as you want, because apparently you've found a way to make as much money as you need in a very short amount of time, which should give you a crap ton of time to have a really meaningful, intimate relationship with one person and then a bunch of kids with that person, but that's not on his list of things that you would do with all that time you've freed up. And I am not even going to touch all the things that are wrong with Andrew Tate and his relationship with women and thank God not children.
Well, first of all, we don't know that Andrew Tate doesn't have kids, but second of all, you have to be very... He might not know. He might not know, yeah. That's also possible. But, it's very hard to judge someone like Andrew Tate, who has a very... a very constructed persona that he presents to the world. Because everyone who's met him in person that I've heard describes him as being extremely polite and thoughtful. And in fact... like a very decent person. And he strikes me, as a former kickboxer, as like Floyd Mayweather. There was that famous fight between Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao, and Pacquiao was the good family Christian guy, and Mayweather in the pre-fight hype was depicted as this bad, nasty, egotistical like asshole essentially. And like it was all for the drama. It was all for the hype. And like whenever anyone caught him off camera, he wasn't being egotistical. He was just training and being normal and being a decent person. Like, and I think Andrew Tate being a marketer, being a salesman, I think salesman is more accurate than marketer, because like he knows how to get attention, and being a over the top asshole is a very good way to get attention, but it's not necessarily indicative of who he actually is, but it also could be. I'm not saying he is or he isn't that. I'm just saying we can't really know that. All we can know is what he's teaching men in like his Hustlers University and his attitude of work, which his life does seem to reflect.
Again, you want to talk about things your wife has against people who don't speak English correctly. That dude's accent is a hot mess, and I can't, it literally, it's like a fork in a garbage disposal to my ears. This is the worst. Absolutely the worst. So on those grounds alone, plus his weird chest tattoo, I'm not into it. But I do think it's so if we were to categorize them, I think you did this well in the podcast. You described them as like the hack model, which is sort of the Tim Ferriss model, which it sounds like Tim Ferriss freed up too much time and got depressed about it. And then Andrew Tate, who's the hustler model. And then what would be the word to describe Mike Rowe? The like work as discipline, or like work as...
Well, so the way I broke it down is that like the three...
I just want the word, like what would be a word for that?
Well, Mike Rowe views work as life, whereas Andrew Tate views work as a means to life, and Tim Ferriss views work as an impediment to life.
Right, okay. That's... I was hoping there was like a hack. Anyway, that's a motif that's not working, but that's fine. What I think is interesting about those three models is that like what Mike Rowe offers in particular that the other two do not is what to do when you are inevitably one of the guys who's actually doing all the work that facilitates the other two, right? So like Tim Ferriss and Andrew Tate necessarily require some people to not be them. They need somebody else to be doing the work.
They need suckers. They need marks.
Right. They need a working underclass to keep their stuff running. And I can't imagine what it is. I've worked for a lot of clients. I work freelance. And so I've worked for a lot of different clients with a lot of different like ethos of how to lead an organization. And I'm hard pressed to imagine that anyone who works for an organization that is run with the attitudes, I don't know that Tim Ferriss has a company, but obviously Andrew Tate has like stuff going on, he's got like a Hustlers University. So there's clearly an admin somewhere answering those emails and stuff. Somebody's issuing refunds and like, fielding like, I can't access my password, like whatever. So, he necessarily has a working underclass below him to support him to some degree, either directly or indirectly. And I just can't imagine that you could be in a company culture where that's the lifestyle he's spouting, but then you're not the one you to be the sucker that's so close to the top that you have to hear the messaging, but it's not for you. Because you're the sucker who actually is working, 40 hours a week or whatever for that guy who literally sits there spouting that particular opinion. It's very incongruous for me personally. And I think that may be, and this is where I get a little bit woo-woo, because I am an Enneagram 3 wing 4, and we love to work. And so work as life, I think it's so much more inclusive for people like me who like profoundly and deeply enjoy the act of working for its own sake. Like making things happen in the world is so satisfying on like a very maybe this is why I have 4 children. It's so exciting when you make things and the things go into the world and exist.
Is Enneagram 3 like equivalent to like a astrological Taurus, would you say? Or
don't hassle me, all right? I very deeply personally identify with being a 3-wing 4, okay? You know who else is? All the serial killer characters. It's very exciting to be the like cool, edgy business person who's like cold inside. Even though I am not cold inside.
I think those people are Scorpios anyways.
You know what? If you could come up with more than one, are they INTJs? You don't know.
Probably.
There's one other one that's something having to do with colors. No, not that. No, that one's legitimate. That one actually has some predictive power. No, I'm talking about the other personality test that people will be like, oh, so I'm an Aquarius, INTJ, Enneagram 3-wing 4 with a like blue. There's one that's like blue, green, orange, and brown. I don't know. There's personality tests are garbage, except for the one that I've personally attached my identity to. And that one I like. But there's something more philosophically consistent, I feel like, if you were to become a disciple of Micro. I don't know, somebody probably answers the emails for the what's this podcast called? The way I heard it. Somebody answers the emails related to that. Somebody's publishing that, and it's not him. Almost certainly.
I can say this: the way that Tate sells it is, I mean, he started off hustling, like working 70-hour weeks, working from the bottom, and you work your way up. And his whole thing is, yeah, you're gonna work menial jobs, you're gonna work sweeping floors, you're gonna do all that stuff, and the guys underneath me are also learning from me. And although they are not doing what I'm doing now, they're learning the skills to do what I do so that they can do it and they can dominate and they can drive the Bugatti. They can, screw all the hot women and, ride,
etc.
Right. And,
okay. So I guess I'm mixing Tim Ferriss and Andrew Tate as though they're necessarily the same. I also had the same issue with the author of Rich Dad Poor Dad,
Robert Kiyosaki.
I get that, like, real estate and those kinds of things. I don't know. I also hang around in a lot of these business circles, so like I also have kind of an issue with like Pat Flynn and these other smart passive income people. It's like, yes, it's great that you've come up with some smart passive income, except it's kind of like a weird Ponzi scheme. Well, I get funny. Like it grosses me out. I don't know.
It's funny because I feel like we're hitting all the deep parts of philosophy. It's like we've hit language already a little bit, and now we're talking about, essentially the question is, what is a good life? And I was listening to Scott Adams do an unusually philosophical stream yesterday. It might have been from the day before yesterday, but someone had asked him, he went down an interesting rabbit hole about physics, and he claimed, I thought very interestingly, that physics doesn't explain anything. As far as, he didn't say that. He didn't say it doesn't explain anything. He said, physics doesn't give you understanding. He says, no one understands physics. He says, all physics does is it replaces mystery with words. And sometimes those words have some predictive quality, but no one understands gravity. No one really understands electricity. It's such an inherently mysterious thing. You can quantify it in ways that are useful, but that quantification, or reciting formulas or descriptions of how our models of the universe work, don't actually, like, it's nothing like understanding. But
it sounds, to return to the analogy you just made earlier, it's the difference between being the finger or being the moon.
Right. And with things like in physics, all we have is the finger, essentially. But I was digressing there a little bit. Scott Adams is an interesting character because he decided at like age 11 or 12 that he was going to be a successful person. And, what does it mean to be successful, and what's the relationship between success, presumably financial, to living a good life. And, there's that famous story of Alexander the Great, arguably an enviable man, fairly successful, if not financially, then at least militarily, the most successful perhaps in history, coming to Greece and running across Diogenes of Sinope. And of course, Diogenes is the famous hobo philosopher, like defecating in public, making fun of Plato, like just the absolute
complete equal disregard for literally everybody. It's like you're standing in my sunlight.
Yeah, and so Alexander the Great, like the greatest conqueror in the world, comes across Diogenes in the street, lying in a ray of sunlight, and Alexander the Great is like, Diogenes, I've heard of you, and Diogenes is like, oh hi, and Alexander the Great said, if I was not Alexander the Great, I would want to be you. To which Diogenes says, if I wasn't Diogenes, I would want to be Diogenes too. and of course, Alexander the Great famously asked, is there anything I can do for you? Is there anything I can provide for you? And Diogenes says, yes, you can step out of my sunlight, please. And it's a secondary point of reference to the Ecclesiastes point I was trying to make, where it's like, there are these people who accomplish these extraordinary things. And they're like, is it really like objectively better than being a hobo? And in a way, it kind of isn't. There is no objective standard of that kind. Now, there are subjective experiences that we share as being human beings, but it does get to the heart of the question, like, what is a good life? Is success in the financial domain necessarily a part of that? I have decided, for myself, for ourselves, I guess, that a certain amount of financial success is sort of, a prerequisite, enough to establish security and a degree of comfort. But beyond that is perhaps not worth it.
Yeah, as just in breaking down, like, Scott Adams decided about himself that he is going to be successful. The only thing that I think is remotely useful or interesting about, like, if you're into astrology, like, by all means, all of us have time to waste in life. So, pick your thing. If that's your hobby.
Which Enneagram are you again?
3-wing 4.
Okay.
The good one, okay. But my point is, though, like Scott Adams, it can sometimes be useful to pick a thing, and maybe this goes back to what Jack Donovan says. It's like, if Jack Donovan's like, do I dress like this in my private life? Yeah, because I'm fucking Jack Donovan. If I don't, and I'm out at Target in, my torn up jeans and my, or torn up shirt and a, sweatpants or whatever, people are going to be like, is that Jack Donovan? To a certain degree, the ideals that we hold or the vision we have for ourselves, the manifestation that we want for ourselves, can encourage us to ever so slightly, repeatedly choose the decision that is slightly more in that direction over and over, and cumulatively you end up with the life that you want. And it's like, did I manifest it by being like, oh, I'm going to be a hustler or whatever, and now I'm a hustler? Like, you can put basketball shorts on, that does not make you a NBA player. But if you consistently choose to practice, you consistently choose to do the things that will lead you in that direction, like, you could end up going, I don't know, semi-pro.
Yeah. Well, to paraphrase Heraclitus, day by day, what you do is who you become. And prior to that, what you think guides what you do. Right. So to bring it back to the work thing, I don't know if this is getting to the heart of your question, but like, the case for the Mike Rowe position is that, work is where virtue is really,
made manifest, maybe.
Well, it's incentivized.
Or made evident.
Yes, it's made. That's a good way of putting it. what you're talking about with Andrew Tate is essentially status and power, which you actually could relate to virtue in a kind of Nietzschean route, I suppose, but it's a lot more like Protestant work ethic. It's like it's something that's revealed rather than something that's developed. I don't know. I'd have to think about it more. But with Tim Ferriss, who's interesting because I like Tim Ferriss. I think he is a good person and a virtuous person, very talented. But like, you're fighting for leisure, essentially. And if day by day what you do is who you become, why not lean into the activities that develop your character in a way that you want to be, assuming a virtuous person is what you want to become? I suppose that's an important presupposition.
Well, yeah, the thing that I think is interesting too that I started to tee up and then missed was in the world of like especially self-help and self-development media, books and podcasts and courses and stuff. I'm regurgitating an opinion I got from another gal, so this isn't a completely original thought, but if you look, you'll see that pretty much all of the like self-help books and stuff like that, like Atomic Habits and Tim Ferriss, these are all written, all of them, like almost unfailingly, are written by white men with no wife or children. And if they do have a wife or children, they're often touring in such a way that like I certainly would question how much time they're actually spending with their children. But almost all of them are childless people who don't have family. And it's like, sure, you can get up and get your, ice bath and your like super rigorous morning routine, and you like drink your, pour over coffee and blah, 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 whatever, when you don't have children and you don't have all these other competing like responsibilities made out of mushy, unsystematic humans. And whenever somebody tries to talk about like balancing family life, suddenly it gets relegated to this like, oh, that's for women. That's for girls. The mom help book, the mompreneur stuff. And it gets pushed into this like, you have a single chapter on how to balance your like daycare schedule and your work responsibilities. And suddenly this is like, you're in a different category and you're kind of shunted to the side of the self-help field such that you do not get the kind of attention that, Tony Robbins is getting.
Well, that's because self-help is about success, and success, men are pursuing success in order to get a woman.
Well, okay, maybe, but like as Tim Ferriss has found, once you have finally systematized down to a 4-hour work week, what the hell are you going to do with all of the rest of that time? And it gets a little lonely and sad and depressing. And the point is to fill your life with something that's important. And if you spend all of your time, I mean, people talk about this when they call into Dave Ramsey's show. They finally got out of debt. They've paid off their house. They've invested all their investments and they've paid for their kids' college. And now they're like, well, now what the hell am I going to do? Because I literally have spent 10 or 15 years in gazelle intensity. And like, who am I now? I've worked so hard to become this person. Like, what am I supposed to do now?
This reminds me.
But also, like, why is success necessarily synonymous with not having family? I like your view that the idea is that you get this success so you can get a family, but you still end up in that trap of like, I've been being this way this whole time, and I no longer, I have not developed any of those other skills that would be required to be like a family man or to be a good spouse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of like people who don't have families, like can't live good lives or anything like that. But there is something that's like kind of revealed, I suppose, but in when you have a family, certain strategies that worked when you were single suddenly become untenable in the context of a family. So when you're getting advice on how to live from a single people, when you yourself are or are planning to have a family, it can be a little bit misleading. But I think this whole conversation takes you down a very interesting rabbit hole of like, what would be the best use of time? What's the best way to use your life more generally? And which I think is the heart of the question that Andrew Tate and Tim Ferriss and Mike Rowe are disagreeing on. And if I could tangent a little bit further, there's this character, Nick Bostrom, that I just spoke with Sean about in the last podcast.
The only one I haven't listened to confess.
Right. But I've mentioned before, but this one is not about transhumanism directly, nor is it about simulation or anything like that. Nick Bostrom is very interesting because he sometimes will write in a parabolic fashion. He wrote a very interesting parable about AI involving sparrows that adopted a baby owl, and one sparrow was like, "Are we really sure we should be doing this?" And the other sparrow's like, "Oh, we'll figure it out when we raise it." Sort of metaphor for the AI. But he wrote this parable called The Fable of the Dragon Tyrant. And basically it metaphorically depicts death as this dragon that is eating people, and people finally figure out how to kill death, how to kill the dragon. But right as they're deciding whether to pursue this attempt or not, all the religious types and the philosophers, people like me, come out of the woodwork in his story and are like, no, it is the proper place of humans to be eaten by the dragon. It is our fate. It's our nature, and blah, blah, blah. In this story, and then, of course, who should disagree with the philosophers and the religious theologians, but a child who says, oh, the dragon ate my grandma. That's not cool. And it's like, BTFO'd by a child, as these stories go. But the conclusion of the story is interesting. In his fable, they do succeed. They send a missile that is able to penetrate the dragon's armor, kills it, and it concludes by saying, what will we do with ourselves now? And his answer is, well, we have all the time in the world to figure that out, because now we have time. And it's like, that sounds so poetic and beautiful, but is in fact so circular and dumb. Like, if you can't figure out what to do with 80 years of life in 80 years, what the hell do you think you're going to figure out to do over like 300 or 3,000 years? Like, and also, like, of course, the purposes change a little bit on that time scale, but like, there are so many, like, not to fall back on the very religious, theologians and philosophers he was denigrating, but there's this tremendous tradition across so many different schools of thought about the importance of the present moment. And now, what are you going to do now? Never mind what tomorrow comes. And like, the question is essentially the same on all of these different time horizons. Mm-hmm. I'm sure some of the details will change, but like, if it is worthwhile to work, if it is worthwhile to study, to have good conversations, to exert yourself, to challenge yourself, to have leisure, to acquire status and power, to reject status and power, whatever things you think are good in life are going to be good in the long run or in the short run in kind of a similar way.
Well, and that's, I think, precisely why it's my objection to the idea that, self-help books should have some more stuff on parenting and family life.
Because that's also part of the substance of life. And the
right.
Self-help sort of presumes that the only things that are important in self-help are financial success and romantic success.
Well, and maybe the third one, which is sort of general self-actualization. Like, you need to eat, pray, love, be yourself, or whatever.
Find yourself.
Find yourself. Like, here, read my book and I'll tell you where to find yourself. They have books to help you find yourself. They also have a whole internet to help you find yourself.
I think those books are called Where's Waldo?
That's the G version. I am thinking of a Steve Martin movie where you need to find your special purpose. That can be the other thing you do. Alone, by yourself. Maybe with the assistance of the internet and tissues. But it's not that I think that like, oh, the mompreneur people should like get more spotlight. It just, there's something so off to me about the fact that like the vast majority of people throughout all of time and even today, even with the just absolutely like dumpster fire birth rates that we have in this country, people still mostly get married and have kids and have families. At the very least, you're probably part of some kind of family network. You have a sibling or you have an ailing parent or like somebody. You've got a village of people who you are responsible for. And those people somehow never hit the pages of these self-help books, even though the vast majority of us are all juggling those things.
You know what's funny? It's bringing me back to our marriage conversation podcast because one of the arguments against marriage that keeps getting brought up is like, oh, they got this 50% divorce rate in America, which is like actually kind of misleading. It's lower for first marriages, but on the other hand, there's this rejection of the mundane and the rejection of the things that everyone else is doing because that doesn't stand out. That won't get you status or power or recognition. And I think a lot of people are looking for recognition. And so we don't want to do marriage because everyone does that and that's easy and boring. But is it really easy? but it's a sort of Schrodinger's aspiration where it's like, if you achieve it, it's boring. But if you don't achieve it, it was doomed to failure because these things always don't work. It's like, well, which one is it? I mean, going back in history, it seems that marriage has always been hard. The famous Socrates line about how, by all means marry. If you get a good wife, you'll be happy. If you have a bad wife, you'll become a philosopher. Maybe an assertion I would disagree with, but it conveys something of the challenge of marriage that people have experienced throughout all of time.
Well, and it's precisely, I think, because the nature of marriage and also the nature of parenting is that, other humans are mushy and complicated. And unlike making money, unlike learning how to buy and invest in real estate or be great at the stock market or be able to, climb the ranks of social organizations that for all the ways in which they are, obviously populated with humans are still run in some kind, there's a system. The premise of meritocracy is that there's a system. There are things that you can do that will push you higher or lower on that ladder of success. You just can't play that kind of game when you are fixed in a day-to-day struggle of wills with a 3-year-old and your spouse who you do love deeply and who you do find interesting, but who also, has annoying qualities. I cannot. If I've already complained about this on the podcast, I apologize, but my husband squeezed the toothpaste from the dead center of the tube, even when it's running out like a chimp, and it drives me nuts, you guys. But I love him anyway and his cute mustache, but those mushy weird things that make people complicated and confusing, and they don't necessarily do exactly what you expect, and sometimes they lie to you, and sometimes things are not what they appeared to be when you signed up, and they develop and grow and change and need new inputs. All of that stuff is very unsystematic, and the most important reason it's unsystematic is because it's one single person, not a giant data set that we can draw normative, commonalities from.
Yeah. And it wouldn't feel satisfying if it was simple and easy. The fact that you're dealing with a complex human being gives a degree of significance to that.
But it's not getting that play. It's the Schrodinger's relationship is exactly the right frame to think of it from, because it somehow simultaneously is so obvious, easy, and
Yeah.
passe that we don't need to remark on it in a book about success. But it also is so complicated that we actually need a whole section of parenting books and relationship books. It's so significant. This is the most important thing you'll ever do in your life. It's not part of your success somehow, because for some reason that's been separated out into a different category.
Well, and I think what it gets down to is that human beings operate in we thrive in tension. You know, we obviously too much stress can crush us, but we can also get like stretched out and atrophied by insufficient stress. It's that famous line from The Matrix where he says, you know, the first Matrix was a paradise. It was a disaster. Your whole crops were lost because people rejected the perfect world they wanted to wake up from. And I think like there's a sweet spot of challenge that we're designed for, that we're built for. And the problem, you know, people are going on and on about AI girlfriends and AI friends and all this other stuff. And I'm sure some people will do that, but I think it will be a very short-lived thing because AI will be in some ways too perfect and it will feel unreal. And it will feel like after a while like a waste of time. And
it's like it's too tame. It's both like, even when you tell it, you know, do something like off the wall, it's going to do the most predictable off the wall thing you can think of.
It makes you superfluous. It's not it's pornographic in that it's not doing anything. Sean, who I was just chatting with about AI and simulation theory and stuff, was posting recently about this horrific, terrifying concept called heaven banning. And that's where a social media platform doesn't ban you exactly. It doesn't censor you. What it does is it uses AI to replace all of your friends and all of your acquaintances and all of your interactions with robots. It isolates you from the real world and places you within an artificial algorithmic circle of pseudo friends who just agree with you and who isolate you in an agreement bubble. Now, it sounds horrifying, but I think that would actually not work, because if you put someone in the heaven band circle, they would just get bored. They would just leave. And by the way, I think that's the problem with Nick Bostrom's dragon-free heaven too. You know, now we can have the time to come up with what we want to do because we'll have time. Having that time also makes you superfluous. And I think what people need is to, more than anything else, is to be needed and to have some purpose. And if you have infinite time, you kind of by definition have no purpose.
Well, precisely because there's no pressure. The reason to get your act together, the reason to, you know, pay attention or to try and optimize your work so that you can leverage the rest of that time to actually spend on things that are important to you, like Tim Ferriss would say, or to get good at your work so you can make enough money to actually support your family. The reason to do that is because you don't have all the time in the world. Yeah. And not to, I want to end on I want to wrap this up. And I want to end with a reference that I've been trying to wedge into this show for all 43 episodes that have come before. The Good Place, man. I don't know how that made it on network television. That is my life, you guys. I am Eleanor Shellstrop, married to Chidi Anagonye, all the time.
I like to think I'm a little bit more decisive, but
oh well, I also think I'm a little taller and better looking than. What's her name? Kristen Bell. She's pretty cute, but I think I have better assets than Kristen Bell has. Anyway, point is, it's my life though, you guys. All philosophy, all the time. And the Good Place does such a good description when they finally
plot spoilers.
Oh, yes. Okay. So there's 4 seasons. It's been out for several years. Get with the times, people. When they finally do eventually make it to the real good place, everyone's gone completely dumb in the head, because when you've got nothing to do and there's no end to it, there's no reason to keep thinking hard. Why would you, like, there's nothing to push against, and there's no reason, there's no tension. The awareness that it's all fleeting, that we're passing, one moment is passing, you will never get the second back. That's the motivation to move, to do things. And, a lot of us can sometimes get sucked into the farcical trap of, television and screens and phones and other things that do feel good. But all of us, I think, know you'll hit that limit at different points. All of us have a different threshold for tolerance. But at some point you hit that moment where you're like, I should go outside. Like, I should go meet other people. There's something missing here. And that artificial life, living it all there is it does turn your brain to mush, because there's no friction. And
I'm hitting the bottom of my second Voodoo Ranger here, so I'll try to be as articulate as I can. But this is like, I think what I tried to write in Holy Nihilism about how real beauty can only exist in tension. Mm-hmm. And to tie it back to work, I mean, what you have in Tim Ferriss is sort of an extremity of rejecting work for its own sake and embracing, leisure. Right. And with Tate, it's like work for status, work. It's extreme the other way. What you have in Micro is a balance, is that tension, because it's not just virtue. Like in his talk about, the safety third, he does say, money is like kind of the reason you're there.
Yeah.
Money is first, the satisfaction of a job well done is second, and safety is third. Yeah. But you're balancing those things. They are forces in tension, and it's that tension, I think, that brings out what we recognize as virtue in people. And to bring it back to Plato, it's not just ideas or the physical world, but there is a tension between these two things, at least as we humans with mind experience them. It's like, we have inherited certain ideas that are sometimes interpretations of the physical world. Maybe the physical world precedes the ideas, but then the ideas in turn become a sort of blueprint for further ideas or physical things that we form and create. And there's a, not just a reciprocating cycle, but also a tension between those two things. And while it can be stressful and a source of anxiety, and at least if you're a philosopher who's dead set on having a system to explain everything, it also seems to be where humans thrive.
That, I think, is a beautiful summary, because it ties together all of the random themes that I wanted to cover. The thing that I love most about your writing is that, for me at least, maybe this because I have a ringside seat to the whole process, I can very clearly see the progression from In Defense of Hatred to Letter to Anwe to Holy Nihilism, and then to The Hero and the Man. I see exactly how these ideas kind of build on each other in a very like slow but clear swell in a moving like worldview direction. And what I love about philosophy is that it's not, I mean, you could probably pick any 5 points and then be able to like tie them together and string and thumbtack it and be like, see, they're all connected. But like, seriously, when you start to think philosophically, you move through the world in a way that kind of starts to make some ordered sense. The order of talking about Plato and the like ideals versus, I mean, we didn't even touch on the Ring of Ganges, but like,
well, I did. In
the podcast. I mean, in this conversation, there's so much depth to topics around philosophy that like you can pick a digression, and then as you move through it, you'll find like it carries you in a direction. And obviously you can see our worldview because you're sitting here listening to this episode too. So I don't know. I think recapping these episodes and coming back to talk about the tangents that were not gone on in the core episode, I think is a fun little exploration. So maybe you had fun too, babe.
Yeah, I did. I was skeptical at first, but I think this turned out well in the end. So, yeah, we'll probably keep doing more of these because it's funny, you know, expecting no theme and worrying about no theme, and then incidentally touching by accident on like some of the deeper things of philosophy, which I don't think we've talked about on this podcast before. So it's a fun conversation. I'll have to figure out how to title this. Anyways, thank you all for listening. I'm sure we'll do more of these in the future. Take care.